I am sitting alone at my kitchen table as I tell you this, months after my son Ethan was arrested. There is a cup of coffee beside my right hand, a ring of house keys beside that, and a thick envelope from my attorney that I still have not opened. Across from me is a photograph of Ethan at 8 years old, his front teeth missing, his hair sticking up after a summer afternoon outside. I keep that photograph there for a reason, not because I want to forget what happened, because I want to remember that the man who hurt me was once the little boy who ran into this kitchen looking for his mother. For 31 years, I worked in a funeral home. I learned early that grief does strange things to people. One morning, I might be helping a family choose a casket, flowers, a photograph for the memorial table, and the song they wanted played at the service. The next morning, I might be sitting quietly while someone argued over a bill because anger was easier for them than admitting they were heartbroken. Some people cried, some became angry, some refused to accept what had happened, and some tried to fix grief with money. I understood that last kind better than I wanted to admit. My husband, Thomas, was sick for a long time before he died. By the end, our lives had narrowed to doctor's appointments, medication schedules, hospital rooms, and quiet drives home. Ethan was 29 when his father died. He was old enough to understand what was happening, but still young enough to need his mother more than he wanted to admit. After the funeral, I went back to work. I answered phones, helped families make arrangements, signed paperwork, and went home at night to wash the coffee cup Thomas had used for years. Ethan started coming by more often. At first, there was nothing unusual. He brought groceries, changed a light fixture, and sometimes sat at the kitchen table with me over coffee. Those visits mattered to me. Ethan was not always selfish. I want to be clear about that because if I told this story as though he had been a monster from the beginning, I would be lying. He had been a good son. That was part of what made everything that came later so difficult to see. A few months after Thomas died, Ethan told me he wanted to start a hospitality business. He had a plan, a name, and more confidence than money. He had found a commercial space, but the numbers were tight. I owned the building, so I offered him a deal. He could use the space for 18 months at a reduced rate while he got the business running. He promised me he would make it work. I believed him. Then the business struggled. Ethan and Brooke had been renting their own place, but the expenses started piling up. One evening, Ethan told me they only needed to stay with me for 6 months. 6 months became 9. 9 became a year. During that year, small things changed. Brooke replaced the old sofa because she said it was uncomfortable. She bought new furniture for the living room. She reorganized my kitchen cabinets because she said the layout made no sense. One afternoon, I noticed the garage lock had been replaced. I asked about it. Brooke said they were trying to make the house more secure. I let it go. That was how most of it happened, not with an argument, not with someone announcing that my life was about to change. It happened through little decisions that seemed too small to fight about. Then one morning, I realized I was sleeping on the living room sofa. Ethan and Brooke were using the main bedroom. I remember standing in the hallway with my coffee, looking at the closed bedroom door. I could have reminded them whose name was on the deed. Instead, I told myself it was temporary. When Brooke noticed me looking at the room, she reminded me that I had said I did not mind. She was right. I had said it. That was the problem. I had spent so many years making things easier for Ethan that I had stopped noticing when easier for him meant smaller for me. Then Brooke started asking questions about my finances. She wanted to know whether I still handled my rental properties myself. She asked if managing bills was becoming tiring. One evening, she casually asked whether I really still needed to handle all the financial stuff on my own. I laughed and brushed it off. I thought she was being helpful. A few weeks later, I came into the kitchen and found a brochure sitting on my dining table.
It was for assisted living communities. Someone had circled one name in blue ink: Maple Grove Senior Living. I stood there for a long time. I did not ask who had left it there. I folded the brochure in half, put it in the kitchen drawer, and went on making coffee. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Looking back, I understand that it was the first warning I chose not to hear.
The brochure from Maple Grove stayed in my kitchen drawer for 3 days. I did not throw it away or ask about it. I left it there and went on. What happened next was almost easier to dismiss because, on the surface, it looked like kindness. Brooke began making appointments for me. First, it was a routine doctor's visit I had been meaning to schedule. Then she offered to arrange a dental appointment. She reminded me about medications and asked if I needed anything from the pharmacy. She also began checking the mail. At first, she sorted envelopes on the counter. Then she started asking about bank statements, my rental properties, and whether I still handled the bookkeeping myself. None of it sounded threatening. That made it difficult. If she had demanded my money, I would have known how to respond. Instead, she brought groceries, made appointments, and asked if I was comfortable driving after dark. When I said I was, she nodded and changed the subject. I remember thinking they really did care about me. Then Ethan started talking about my age. One morning, while I was looking for my keys, he reminded me that I was 66 and did not have to keep doing everything myself. I told him I knew. A few days later, I forgot a doctor's appointment. It was a simple mistake. I had written it on my calendar and still missed it. Ethan treated it like evidence. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at me and said, "See?" That one word stayed with me. After that, ordinary mistakes seemed to become part of a larger story. If I misplaced my glasses, Brooke questioned my memory. If I forgot a receipt, Ethan questioned whether I was still managing the rental properties. If I came home tired, Brooke suggested I was doing too much. I kept hearing the same message in different forms. I was tired. I was getting older. I was doing too much. I needed help. Somewhere along the way, their concern stopped being about what I needed and started becoming about what they believed I could no longer do. One afternoon, I heard Brooke talking to Ethan in the hallway. I was in the kitchen and they did not know I could hear them. She said I should not be handling the rentals alone. Neither of them called me incapable. They didn't need to. The brochures were appearing. Appointments were being arranged. Forms were being printed. Questions about my accounts were becoming more specific. They were building a narrative about me, one small detail at a time. Then the financial questions became harder to ignore. Brooke offered to organize my bills. She said it would take pressure off me and make things easier for everyone. I told her I could handle them. Later, Ethan tried a softer approach. He made one thing clear. They were not asking for money. That was true. They were asking for access. The first time Ethan mentioned financial power of attorney, he presented it as a practical precaution. If something happened to me, he said, somebody needed to be able to handle things. I asked why it had to be somebody else. He reminded me that he was my son. I did not argue, but I started paying closer attention. The next morning, I called Daniel Mercer, the attorney who had handled my estate documents for years. He asked what had changed, when it started, and whether anyone had asked me to sign anything. Then he told me to review everything. He checked my property titles, estate plan, and beneficiary designations. He explained how an irrevocable family trust could protect certain assets if I chose to use one. I told him I was not trying to punish my son. I reminded him that Ethan and Brooke were my family. Daniel listened and gave me one sentence I have never forgotten. That doesn't make them your fiduciaries. Until then, I had been treating family and access as though they were the same thing. They were not. Daniel also checked whether Ethan had recently made inquiries about my assets. What he found bothered me more than I expected. Ethan had contacted a broker about the value of 2 commercial properties I owned. He had also asked about the old funeral home building and the house where I was living. I confronted him that evening. He did not become angry. He did not deny it. He said he was only trying to understand what everything was worth. That answer was worse than a lie. For the first time, I looked at my son and saw an adult man measuring the walls around me. That night, I came home late. Another folder was waiting on the kitchen table. On the front, someone had written, "For Mom, just in case." Inside were a draft financial power of attorney, a list of my properties, a medical authorization form, and another sheet of assisted living information. I did not sign anything. I closed the folder and stood there with both hands on the table. Then I picked up my phone. For the first time in months, I called Daniel without trying to explain the situation away. I told him what I had found. Then I said what I had been avoiding. I think we need to protect everything now. 3 years before Ethan was arrested, North Star Table and Brewing was close to collapsing. I remember the night he came to my house because I had never seen my son that way. His restaurant had been losing money for months. He owed about $263,000 between suppliers and bank obligations. Brooke had borrowed against her retirement account to keep the business moving. Payroll taxes were behind. Rent was late. The landlord was preparing to enforce the lease. Ethan sat at my kitchen table with his head in his hands. Then he finally looked at me and said, "Mom, I built this." I could have written him a check that night. I did not. My father had taught me a lesson I had forgotten more than once. Giving someone enough money to survive is different from giving them enough money to avoid learning. So I called Daniel Mercer. We went through North Star's books, its debts, its lease, its supplier obligations, and the financing that could still be restructured. I did not want to put cash into Ethan's hands and pretend the problem had disappeared. If I helped, I wanted the help to create a structure that could survive even if Ethan made mistakes. Daniel helped establish Blue Lantern Holdings, LLC. We kept my name and the Callahan name out of it. Through Blue Lantern, we acquired a 34% interest in North Star. At the same time, we guaranteed a restructured financing arrangement that kept the business from losing its lease and gave it room to address its overdue obligations. My total exposure came to roughly $742,000. That number still makes me pause. At the time, though, I saw it differently. I was not simply handing Ethan $742,000. I was putting structured money and contractual protection behind a business that still had a chance. Daniel also built appropriate change of control and default provisions into the agreements. If Ethan committed financial fraud, materially breached the agreement, engaged in criminal conduct connected to the business, or deliberately exploited a protected family guarantor, Blue Lantern could terminate its guarantee, accelerate secured obligations where contractually permitted, and use the contractual remedies available to it. Nothing was automatic. Nothing depended on a future accusation. The protections were tied to the agreements and the collateral. I remember asking Daniel whether all that language was really necessary. He answered, "I hope you'll never need it." I signed. Then I stepped away. Ethan never knew I was behind Blue Lantern. As far as he understood, an investment group from Chicago had decided North Star was worth saving. When he called me after the deal closed, his voice sounded lighter. He told me some investor actually believed in him. I could have told him the truth. Instead, I said, "Then make sure they were right." That was all.
I watched from a distance as North Star stabilized. Suppliers were paid under the new arrangements. The financing was restructured. Ethan kept the restaurant open. Slowly, the panic that had filled his life began to disappear, and with it came his confidence. I did not need him to know what I had done. I did not need the credit. I wanted him to believe he had earned the recovery himself. Looking back, that decision explains more about my later mistakes than I like to admit. I had spent years confusing protection with love. When Ethan succeeded, I stayed invisible. When he struggled, I stepped in. When he needed a second chance, I gave him one. I thought I was teaching him independence by refusing to let him see the size of the safety net beneath him. I did not realize that a person can become dependent on a safety net, even when he cannot see it. 3 years later, I remembered something Ethan had said after North Star survived. He had thanked me for being there. He said he couldn't have done it without me. Those words once felt like proof that he understood what I had sacrificed. Later, they sounded different, because the same man who once believed he couldn't have survived with my help was now treating me as though I were too old to manage my own money. That contradiction mattered. I did not create Ethan's entitlement in one day. I had helped build the conditions around him that made it possible. After the concerns I had raised with Daniel, I agreed to finish the protections we had discussed. We completed the family trust documents. The properties were transferred according to the legal requirements, and Daniel took the appropriate trustee or administrative role within the structure. I still controlled my own life. The difference was that access to my assets was no longer based on the assumption that being my son gave Ethan a right to them. I did not tell him. I did not do it to punish him. I did it because I finally understood something I had spent years avoiding. Protecting someone from every consequence is not always an act of love. Sometimes love means allowing a person to stand on his own. And sometimes protecting yourself is not revenge. It's simply the moment you stop confusing love with permission.
It was a cold February evening in Indiana when I came home from the funeral home and found Ethan and Brooke waiting for me. I had spent the day helping another family make decisions they never expected to face. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the temperature had dropped below freezing, and the last thing I expected was to walk into my own kitchen and find a folder and a pen waiting on the table. Ethan was sitting across from it. Brooke stood near the counter. I knew immediately that this was not a conversation about dinner. Ethan told me we needed to settle things that night. He started listing the subjects as if he were reading from an agenda: my properties, the business, the power of attorney, and what would happen with my future care. I listened. Then he told me I was making everything harder than it needed to be. For months, I had answered questions, accepted advice, and explained away behavior that made me uncomfortable. I had told myself that Ethan was under pressure. I had told myself that Brooke was only trying to help. I had even convinced myself that the assisted living brochure was an awkward attempt at planning for the future. But that night, something in me finally became clear. I said no. It was only one word. I had said no to grieving families who wanted impossible things. I had said no to business deals that did not make sense. I had said no to people who wanted more than my funeral home could provide. But I had almost never said it to Ethan. Brooke reacted first. She accused me of being paranoid and confused. She said I was letting my emotions interfere with decisions that were supposed to protect me. I remember standing there and listening to her describe me as though I was someone she had already decided I had become. Then I looked at Ethan. I was not waiting for him to defend every decision I had made. I was waiting for one simple thing. I wanted him to tell Brooke to stop. He did not. He just stood there. That silence told me more than an argument could have. Brooke moved toward me.
I stepped back. The next thing I remember clearly was the sudden force against my body and the kitchen floor coming up beneath me. She had pushed me. My head struck the floor. For a few seconds, I could not make sense of what had happened. I felt blood running down the side of my face and pain spreading through my shoulder. But the worst part was not the fall. It was what happened afterward. Ethan did not come toward me. He looked at Brooke, she looked at him, and then Ethan said, "We have to go." I heard those words while I was still on the floor. That was the moment I stopped making excuses for my son. Not because Brooke had pushed me, not even because they had left me injured. It was because Ethan had been given a choice. He could have come to me. He could have called 911. He could have told Brooke that what she had done was wrong. Instead, he chose to leave. Brooke picked up the folder from the table. Ethan said they would deal with everything the next day. Then the front door closed. A few moments later, I heard their car leave the driveway. I was alone. For years, I had worked around death. I knew what emergencies looked like. I knew what people did when someone was hurt. So I did not call Ethan. I did not call a friend and ask what I should do. I called 911. I told the dispatcher exactly what had happened. I told her I had been assaulted in my home, that I was bleeding, and that I had hit my head. That sentence was difficult to say, not because it was complicated, because it was true. The police arrived before the ambulance took me to the hospital. I answered their questions as clearly as I could. I did not tell them I had slipped. I did not protect Ethan from the consequences of what I had witnessed. At the hospital, doctors treated the cut on my head and gave me stitches. They diagnosed me with a mild concussion and documented bruising around my shoulder. They kept me overnight for observation. A doctor asked me how the injury had happened. I told her. A nurse recorded it. Then law enforcement documented it too. For the first time, I understood why telling the truth mattered more than trying to control what happened next. I did not need to become an investigator. I did not need to gather evidence myself. I did not need to invent a plan in the middle of the night. The hospital records, the injury, the police report, and the statements I gave were enough to begin documenting what had happened. Later, a detective asked me whether I wanted to press charges. I looked down at my bandaged hand. For most of my life, I had believed that protecting people meant absorbing the consequences for them. That night, I finally understood the difference between protection and silence. I answered, "I want the truth documented," and for the first time, I meant it.
The morning after I was discharged from the hospital, I was still sore, tired, and moving carefully. I had spent the night under observation after the fall, and I was beginning to understand that the hardest part of what happened was no longer the injury. It was what Ethan and Brooke were willing to do after it. They came to the hospital that afternoon. Neither arrived looking frightened or ashamed. Brooke carried a manila envelope. Ethan walked beside her with the same controlled expression he had worn at my kitchen table. They did not begin with an apology. They began by telling me they did not want things to get ugly. I looked at the envelope and then at my son. After everything that had happened, I expected anger, perhaps an explanation, maybe even an attempt to blame the argument on stress. Instead, they changed their approach. They told me the papers were only meant to make things easier. Brooke said the accident proved I could not keep doing everything alone. That word bothered me. Accident. I had already told the police what happened. The hospital had documented my injuries. But Ethan and Brooke were now trying to turn the same event into something useful for them. I opened the envelope. Inside were documents concerning my property deeds, financial power of attorney, medical authorization, and property management arrangements. They were presented as practical paperwork, the kind of thing a family might organize when an older parent needed assistance. But I knew something they did not know.
The properties they were trying to control had already been placed into the trust Daniel and I had established. They did not know this because I had never told Ethan. I also knew the papers in front of me could still matter. They could create access, authority, or confusion if handled carelessly. So I did not challenge them. Instead, I let my shoulders drop. I moved slowly. I allowed them to see what they wanted to see, a tired woman who might be finally too exhausted to fight. I told myself I was not becoming weak. I was watching. Then I signed, one page at a time. I paused between signatures. I read every page before putting my name on it. I made sure I understood what I was signing, and I kept my face as blank as I could. Ethan watched the pen move. Brooke watched Ethan. By the time I reached the final page, the tension in the room had changed. Ethan's shoulders relaxed. Brooke's expression softened. They believed the resistance was over. Ethan looked at me and said he was glad I had finally come to my senses. I answered, "So am I." He heard one meaning. I meant another. They gathered the documents and left. I waited until the door closed before making my next move. I did not reach for a hidden phone or some dramatic device. I used a simple backup phone Daniel had given me, because after everything that had happened at home, he had become concerned about who might have access to my primary phone. I called him. I told him exactly what had happened. Then I told him the important part. They had signed nothing that actually changed the assets protected by the trust, but they believed they had. Daniel understood immediately. He told me to let them act. That was the moment the balance shifted. Ethan did exactly what I expected. He started calling brokers. He asked questions about the commercial properties and their current market values. He contacted his accountant and began talking about opening a second location for North Star. He started making plans to pay down debts. He was no longer thinking about whether he could survive. He was thinking about what he could buy. What he did not know was that the contractual protections attached to Blue Lantern had already become relevant. North Star still had approximately $480,000 in outstanding secured obligations. A portion of the business collateral had been pledged under the financing structure. That did not mean someone could press a button and take everything away. It meant paperwork would begin. The lender could issue notice. Contractual acceleration could be triggered where the agreement allowed it. Accounts could be restricted. An audit could follow. And if the contractual conditions for enforcement were met, the pledged collateral could be pursued through the remedies provided in the financing documents. The process was slower than revenge stories usually make it sound. It was also much more real. Ethan simply did not know that the machinery had started moving. Later that evening, he opened the company's banking portal. I was not there when he saw the message, but Daniel was able to confirm what happened next. A red banner appeared across the account. Account restricted. Contact lender. Ethan called the lender immediately. The person on the other end did not argue with him or explain the whole history. They simply told him that the guarantee had been terminated. Ethan asked why. The answer was brief. A contractual default has been triggered. For the first time, the papers Ethan thought had made him powerful were sitting in his hands, while the protections he never knew existed were beginning to work against the plans he had already made.
3 days after the lender restricted North Star's account, Ethan stopped pretending the problem would solve itself. He called his accountant first, then his attorney, then the lender, then the investment contacts he had relied on during the restaurant's recovery. Each call gave him another piece of information, but none gave him the answer he wanted. The bank could explain the restriction. The attorney could explain the notice. The lender could point to the financing documents, but nobody was willing to tell him what had changed overnight. North Star was not closed. That was what made the situation so frightening. The doors were still open, the kitchen was still operating, and customers were still arriving, but behind the scenes, the business was losing the ability to function normally. Payroll was delayed. A supplier stopped another delivery until outstanding questions were resolved. The company's bank account remained restricted. Equipment became subject to a legal hold while the parties sorted out the lender's rights. At the same time, the lease situation became increasingly uncertain. Employees began asking Ethan what was happening. He had no useful answer. Managers started postponing ordinary decisions because nobody knew which expenses could be safely paid. Even routine purchases suddenly required approval, and every unanswered email made the staff more nervous. He had built a company that looked stable from the outside. Now he was discovering how quickly a business could become fragile when the money moving through it was no longer entirely under his control. For years, Ethan had been the person who walked into a room and acted as though he knew what came next. Now he was making calls simply to discover what had already happened. His attorney eventually found the provision that mattered. The investor had rights under the agreement. Ethan wanted to know who the investor was. The answer did not come immediately. That was when the story stopped looking like a banking problem and started looking like something much closer to home. He called me. I was sitting in my kitchen when my phone began to vibrate. I saw his name and let it ring. The first call ended. A few minutes later, he called again. Then came a message asking me to call him. A third attempt followed, this time mentioning the business. I still did not answer. I was not ignoring him because I wanted him to suffer. I simply knew that whatever he wanted from me, he was now trying to reach me after the consequences had already begun. Meanwhile, the detective handling my assault continued the investigation. The hospital records had already documented my injuries. My statement had been taken, photographs had been preserved. The detective also obtained the relevant home security footage. The footage mattered because it removed the room for interpretation. It showed Brooke moving toward me. It showed the push. It showed me falling. It showed Ethan standing there and seeing what happened. It showed that he did not call for help. And it showed both of them leaving the house. I did not have to exaggerate any of it. I did not have to convince anyone that Ethan was responsible for Brooke's actions. The footage simply recorded what happened. That distinction mattered to me. I had spent enough years trying to explain my son's behavior in the most generous possible way. I was not going to start changing facts just because I was hurt. Daniel was handling the legal side of my financial protections. At one point, he told me there were ways to make Ethan and Brooke's lives very difficult. I understood what he meant. I also knew what I did not want. I did not want revenge. I wanted the law to do its job. I told Daniel that was all I wanted. The more Ethan searched through North Star's old records, the closer he came to something he had never noticed before: Blue Lantern Holdings, LLC. The name appeared in the investment and financing documents connected to the business. It was not a mysterious government agency or some anonymous corporation that had appeared out of nowhere. It was the entity that had quietly stood behind the investment structure 3 years earlier. Ethan asked who owned it. He did not get an answer from Daniel, so he went back through the paperwork. He found the original agreement. He read the ownership provisions. Then he stopped at a signature. It was not my name, but beside the registered office information was an address he recognized. My address. He stared at it long enough for the conclusion to begin forming without anyone explaining it to him. The investor who had saved North Star 3 years earlier had not been a distant group from Chicago. Someone had been much closer, someone he had stopped seeing as the person who made his recovery possible. Someone he had recently tried to convince was too old to manage her own affairs. He called me again. This time I answered. There was a long silence before he finally spoke. "Mom, do you know who Blue Lantern is?"
I did not explain. I did not defend myself. I simply answered yes, and then I waited. For the first time, Ethan was the one who had to sit with a truth he could not control.
I answered the phone because by then I knew Ethan was no longer calling to ask for help. He was calling because the version of his life he had trusted was beginning to disappear. He asked if it had been me. I did not answer immediately. I wanted him to say what he meant. Then he asked whether I had been behind the investment, the loan, all of it. I told him that 3 years earlier, North Star had been 6 months away from losing everything. There had been roughly $263,000 in overdue obligations, creditors waiting for payment, payroll problems, and a lease that was in danger. Brooke had already borrowed against her retirement account to keep the business alive. Ethan had come to my kitchen table believing he had run out of options. I remembered that night clearly because it was one of the few times I had seen my son cry over his own failure. He had told me he built North Star. I had believed him. I also believed that if I simply wrote him a check, I would be solving the wrong problem. So I called Daniel. We created Blue Lantern Holdings LLC. It acquired the 34% interest in North Star and supported the restructured financing. My total exposure reached about $742,000. Ethan never saw my name on the arrangement. He believed an outside investment group had decided his business was worth saving. That was intentional. I wanted him to believe he had built something himself. I did not want to buy his gratitude. I wanted to leave him his dignity. When he once told me that some investor finally believed in him, I told him to make sure they were right. At the time, he thought I was encouraging him. I was, but I was also watching. There was a long silence on the phone after I finally told him the truth. Then Ethan asked why I had never told him. The answer was simple, although it took me years to understand what it meant. I thought protecting him from failure was love. I did not realize I was also protecting him from consequences. I had spent so many years stepping in before Ethan hit the ground that he stopped learning what the ground felt like. That was my part in the story. I could not blame Brooke for every boundary Ethan crossed. I could not blame his business for every decision he made. And I could not pretend that my own generosity had played no role in creating the expectations that later became entitlement. But Ethan still wanted to understand the agreement. He asked why I had put the protective clause into the financing documents in the first place. I told him that an investment agreement is supposed to protect both sides. That was the truth. I had not written that clause because I expected him to hurt me. I had not predicted Brooke would push me to the kitchen floor. I had not secretly planned some elaborate trap. 3 years earlier, Daniel and I had simply built reasonable protections into a serious financial arrangement. That was all. The difference was that Ethan had eventually triggered them himself. He had not lost the business because I wanted revenge. He had lost the protection because he had broken the conditions he once agreed to. That distinction mattered to me. I wanted him to understand that I had not reached across the table and taken his future away. He made choices. Those choices had consequences. Then he asked about the night at my house. I told him the security system had recorded what happened that Tuesday. He went quiet. He asked whether I had given the footage to the police. I told him I had given them the truth, nothing more. I had not edited it. I had not exaggerated it. I had not told investigators what I wanted them to believe. I had given them the hospital records, my statement, the photographs, and the footage. The evidence could speak for itself. For years, I had protected Ethan by speaking for him. That night, I finally stopped. There was another silence. Then I heard something in his voice I hadn't heard since he was a boy. He said, "Mom." I knew what was coming before he finished. He was crying. I wanted to comfort him.
Every instinct I had as his mother told me to soften the moment, tell him everything would be all right, and find another way to carry the weight for him. But I had done that for too long. So I told him that I loved him. I also told him that love was no longer going to protect him from the consequences of what he had chosen. Then I ended the call. I did not shout. I did not insult him. I did not tell him that he deserved to lose everything. I simply put the phone down. For the first time in my life, I understood that letting someone face the truth is not the opposite of love. Sometimes it is the last honest form of it.
The arrests did not happen in front of me. Brooke was arrested at the salon. Ethan was arrested at North Star. I did not go to either place. I did not stand outside waiting to see my son in handcuffs. I had spent enough of my life trying to control what happened to Ethan. I was finished doing that. I let the police and the courts do their jobs. The evidence was straightforward. My hospital records, photographs of my injuries, my statement, and the security footage from my home. The financial records and contractual documents told their own story, too. I did not need to add anything. Ethan eventually accepted responsibility through a plea arrangement for the charges that applied to his conduct. Brooke's case went to trial, where the evidence concerning the assault and related exploitation was presented. The court addressed restitution and the financial consequences that followed. I did not measure justice by the number of years someone might spend behind bars. For me, justice was simpler. The truth was finally on the record. After that, recovery became much less dramatic. It was physical therapy, short walks that slowly became longer, learning to move my shoulder without thinking about the bruising, getting behind the wheel again, returning to the funeral home and seeing former employees. The first time I walked through those doors, one of them hugged me. We did not talk about Ethan. We talked about work and the families waiting for us that day. That ordinary conversation meant more to me than I expected. My scar remained. I stopped hiding it. Eventually, I made a decision about the funeral home. I sold the remaining portion of the business I still owned. Part of the proceeds became the Callahan Family Care Fund, created to support older adults facing financial exploitation, caregiver abuse, or coercive family control. I had spent decades helping families through loss. Now I wanted to help people protect the lives they still had. I kept one small room at the old funeral home. It was not an office. It became a quiet place where families could talk about estate planning, financial boundaries, and resources for elder abuse. I was not a lawyer, so I never pretended to be one. I connected people with attorneys, financial professionals, social workers, and appropriate local resources. My advice was simple: get the right people around you before you need them. Months later, I received a letter from Ethan. I recognized his handwriting before opening it. I left it on the kitchen table for 2 days. When I finally read it, there was no demand for money or request that I sign something. There was only uncertainty. He wrote that he did not know if I would ever forgive him. I folded the letter and put it away. I did not answer, not because I wanted to punish him, but because forgiveness was not something I could force myself to perform on a deadline. I may forgive Ethan someday. Maybe I already have in some ways. But I learned that forgiveness does not mean access. It does not mean giving someone money, signing papers, rescuing a business, or opening your home to someone who has violated its boundaries. Forgiveness doesn't require access. One evening, I stood in front of my house and looked toward the room Ethan had once used. It was empty now. I had turned it into a small study and library. There was one photograph of Ethan at 8 years old on the desk. I did not throw it away. I did not turn it face down. I placed it in a drawer. Then I opened the window.
Fresh air moved through the room, and sunlight crossed the empty desk. For years, I thought being a good mother meant making sure my son never fell. Then I learned something I wish I'd understood when he was 20. A mother can catch her child when he falls, but she cannot spend the rest of her life standing beneath him. I still loved my son. I simply stopped confusing love with rescue.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.